Good evening, everyone. Hey, how's it going? This is So Real here, and I have, a sister soldier to God here, Rakell. And today we're going to keep it nice and short. This is a presentation that is strictly dealing with women and the New Testament. You're going to see basically by the end of this presentation that it's not going to be is meaty and hefty, mainly because this is more of an introduction of a series of lessons that are going to be taught in the near future by Cherry Love and Raquel Salter, the women of the Soldiers of God. And so all I'm doing is just basically an introductory lesson. It's not going to be that long. Matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and start it right now. I apologize for the technical difficulties. And, if there is anybody that is in the chat or anything that simply can't hear me because that's what they said on the last video, please let me know because this is a new microphone. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and begin. Women in the New Testament. A walk through the scriptures of women who taught, led, and labored in the gospel. This is a brief introduction lesson that will explore, explain, and expound on the life, ministry, status, and positions of women in the New Testament. The remaining lessons to come will be further taught by Soldiers of God members Cherry Love and Raquel Salter. Disclaimer: I do not teach that women are bishops or priests. So you guys can go ahead and put your theological guns down. And with that being said, I can go ahead and continue. Oop, just a second. I have to make sure this is all correct. Okay, good. Still trying to work out some technical difficulties here. Like I said, I don't know what's up with all the bugs today. I seem to be having a devil of a time here. So I definitely do apologize, everybody. Okay, and there we go. And one more thing. All right. Okay, so we are back. So with that being said, let's begin. Paul fondly mentions women in his letters. You have Aphia, Chloe, Claudia, Euodia, Julia, Junia. You have Lois and Eunice. Of course, you have Mary. You have Nereus' sister. There's Persis, Phoebe, Priscilla. You have Syntyche. You have Tryphena and Tryphosa. These women were actively involved in significant ministry and some even as leaders. Women were present when the time of the church first began, and also women were added to the church. That's Acts 1:14, Acts 5:14, and Acts 8 verse 12. I simply won't read it for time's sake. Women and the New Testament. Ephesians 4:11 reveals 5 offices in the church that we exercise today. We will not touch on leaders. We will touch on leaders and only explore 2 of those 5 offices: evangelists and teachers. Ephesians 4:11 through 13. And he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4, chapter 11, verse 13. Those are the 5 offices that are operated in our churches today. Priscilla, or Prisca, whichever one you want to call her, and her husband Aquila are mentioned 6 times in the New Testament. They are always mentioned together, and 4 of those 6 times, Priscilla's name is mentioned first. This uncommon order of the wife's name before her husband's may be an indication that Priscilla's ministry, ability, or status was more prominent than her husband Aquila's. So these are the six times that they're mentioned. And if you actually look in Acts 18, Aquila is mentioned first. Then you have Acts 18 again, and Priscilla is mentioned first. And further down in Acts 18, Priscilla is mentioned first again, followed by Romans 16. Then there's 1 Corinthians 16:9, and Aquila is mentioned first. And then finally in 2 Timothy 4, Priscilla is again mentioned first. That's 4 out of 6 times. We'll find out why that's the case later on. At some point, they even risked their lives for Paul's sake. And so it says in Romans 16, verse 3 through 5, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the church that is in their house. Salute my well beloved Epanetus, who is the first fruits of Achaia unto Christ. Priscilla, Aquila, and Paul traveled together to Ephesus in Acts chapter 18, verse 18. That's basically where they had their first church. Had confidence in the abilities of both Priscilla and Aquila as church leaders, and he left them in Ephesus to lead a church that met in their house. 1 Corinthians 16:19. It was while Priscilla and Aquila were leading a church at Ephesus that they met Apollos. Now, Apollos is literally described by Luke as, quote, a man of words. This reveals that he was an eloquent speaker, trained in rhetoric. It also indicates that he was well read and highly educated. After all, he was from Alexandria. Its significance is a whole nother topic alone. Anybody that knows about the Alexandrian library, and of course that is where the Greek Septuagint was produced, which was 72 elders of Jews that came together to produce the Greek version of the Old Testament, and it came from a lost Hebrew text that we no longer have today. From Luke's description of Apollos, both definitions fit well. He portrays him as both an eloquent orator and someone with thorough, literally powerful understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, for the main point of focus. Acts 18:24 through 26. Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. That comes from the NASB version of the Bible. Did Priscilla, being named first, teach such a learned man? The answer is yes, an emphatic yes. Despite Apollo's notable credentials, something was lacking in his theology. He was ignorant of Christian baptism. Pretty much he put the emphasis of the baptism of John, right? Priscilla and Aquila recognized this lack, and as leaders of the local church, they took Apollos aside and explained to him, quote, the way of God, that is, theology, more accurately. Ektithemi is the word used. Nevertheless, Priscilla and Aquila did, in fact, teach. Teach, didasko. Didasko is the Greek word usually translated as teach or instruct. And of course, anybody that knows BDAG is basically the lexicon of all lexicons. I mean, it's the one that you go to if you really do want to find some stuff out. It defines didasko as 1, to tell someone what to do, tell, instruct, and 2, to provide instruction in a formal or informal setting. Teach. Apollos himself described as someone who was speaking and teaching didasko accurately about Jesus. That's Acts 18:25. Therefore, the verb explain in the plural is plural in the Greek, indicating that both Priscilla and Aquila were involved. However, the fact that Priscilla's name is listed first before her husband in Acts 18:26 shows that either A, Priscilla had a special status, or B, was the more active one in giving the explanation. This unconventional order of the wife's name before her husband's could be that Priscilla's ministry ability and or status was more prominent than Aquila's. So, in the very next chapter, chapter 19, Luke writes about Paul's 3 months speaking ministry in the synagogue at Ephesus. He uses related words to teach of the 3 different verbs in reference to Paul speaking about the kingdom of God. Here's the 3 words that he uses in the Greek for Paul teaching. You have parazazomai, that's speaking boldly or freely. Dialegomai, discuss or reason. And patho, persuade. These are the words that he used. He did not use the word teach. So Luke does not specifically use the word teach or didasko here when he's talking about what Paul did in those 3 months in the synagogue. And yet there can be no doubt that during those 3 months at Ephesus, Paul did in fact teach. He taught freely by using reasoning and persuasion. It is unreasonable, therefore, to suggest that Paul's ministry in Acts 19, verses 8 through 9, did not include teaching simply because Luke did not use the word didasko. It is equally unreasonable to suggest that Priscilla and Aquila's explanation to Apollos did not include teaching just because Luke did not use the word didasko. Priscilla and Aquila did, in fact, teach Christian doctrine to Apollos. This becomes clear when you look at the meaning of explain, ektithemai, and the circumstances where Luke uses it elsewhere in Acts. By the way, one more thing that I found interesting is that when you actually go on to about the story about Apollos, you actually do kind of hear him being named among the apostles. When Paul is actually complaining to, I believe, the Corinthians, he says, I'm glad I didn't baptize you. He said, were you baptized by Apollos? Did you hear your preaching from somebody else? So even Paul is recognizing this learned man, but he still had to have some help in his theology and his steps along the way, right? And that was after he had received that teaching that you start to hear about him even more. Explain, ektithemai. Luke is the only one or the only New Testament author to use the Greek word ektithemai. He uses it 4 times and only in the book of Acts. There are 2 basic meanings for the word ektithemai. In its most literal sense, it means to place outside or expose. In this sense, BDAG says, gives the definition of ektithemai as withdraw, support, or protection from. Luke uses a word in this sense in Acts 7:21, where he recounts Stephen speaking about the baby Moses who was placed outside and left exposed on the Nile. Ektithemai also means to put forth, declare, explain. In this sense, it gives the definition of ektithemai as, quote, to convey information by careful elaboration. This sounds a lot like teaching to me. Luke uses a word in this sense 3 times in Acts, of Peter in Acts 11, of Priscilla and Aquila, Acts 18, and of Paul in Acts 28. It is important to note that there is nothing at all that trivial in these 3 instances where explain ektithemai is used. So here is a quote from Stark and Rise of Christianity, and also another notable individual who is Malkso. He actually wrote something called The First Century Church and the Ministry of Women. So, quote, it is well known that the early church attracted an unusual number of high status women, and that is A, some of these women who lived in relatively spacious homes hosted a congregation that met in their home. As a prominent member of the congregation, the host would have functioned as a leader, employing a ministry gift, possibly the pastor-teacher gift. Once again, That's in terms of leadership, not headship. Priscilla and Aquila were active in ministry and hosted a church in their home at Ephesus and later at Rome, where they ministered as pastor teachers, or in other words, leaders. So, Euodia and Syntyche, evangelists, leaders. When Paul describes the ministry of Euodia and Syntyche, Paul uses a couple of the same terms he had applied previously to Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul writes that Euodia and Syntyche had contended together with him, quote, in the gospel. Earlier in the letter, Paul had described Timothy as someone who had served with him, quote, in the gospel in Philippians. Furthermore, Paul goes on to therefore to refer to Euodia and Syntyche as, quote, his, quote, co-workers. Earlier, Paul had referred to Epaphroditus as his, quote, co-worker in verse 25. The Apostle Paul names Euodia and Syntyche in his letter to the Philadelphians, and in just 2 verses, he gives just a glimpse into the value and significance of their ministries. This is Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Quote, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to think the same thing in the Lord. Indeed, I ask you, my true companion or my yokefellow, to help them, these women who have contended together with me in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. That's Philippians chapter 4, verse 2 and 3. So, women in Macedonia. Yes, I'm going to talk about some women in Macedonia. Why? Because the church that was written into the Philippians were in Macedonia. It was not unusual for women to have leading roles in Philippi. Philippi was a chief city of Macedonia, Acts 16. And it has been well documented that Macedonian women enjoyed greater freedoms, rights, and powers than many other women of the time. You have another quote here. This is from W. Tarn and G.T. Griffin. If Macedonia produced perhaps the most competent group of men the world had yet seen, the women were in all respects the men's counterparts. They played a large part in affairs, received envoys, and obtained concessions for them for them from their husbands, built temples, founded cities, engaged mercenaries, commanded armies, held fortresses, and acted on occasion as regents and even co-rulers. So, also, there is another individual who died in 1978 named William Barclay who also wrote on this sentiment. He said, quote, we can see this freedom of women even in the narrative of the Acts of Paul's work in Macedonia. In Philippi, Paul's first contact was with the meeting for prayer by a riverside. And he spoke to the women gathered there in Acts 16. Lydia was obviously a leading figure in Philippi. Then in Thessalonica, many of the chief women were won for Christianity. And the same thing happened at Berea. It is well worth remembering that when we are thinking of the place of women in the early church and of Paul's attitude to them, that in the Macedonian churches, they are clearly at a leading place. So, this is one of my favorite theologians, John Chrysostom, and I could say a whole bunch about him, but if you don't know anything about John Chrysostom, I urge you, please study this man. John Chrysostom is an awesome dude. Early church bishop and theologian John Chrysostom, he died in 407 AD, believed that Euodia and Syntyche were leading women in the Philippian church, and he compared them to Phoebe, a woman minister, diakonos, in the church at Centria. That's Romans 16. In his 13th homily on the Philippians, he wrote, quote, these women, Euodia and Syntyche, seemed to me to be the chief of the church which was there, and Paul commends them to some notable man whom he calls his yoke fellow. Paul commends them to him as to a fellow worker and fellow soldier and brother and companion, as he does in the epistle to the Romans when he says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a minister of the church at Centria. That's his commentary on Romans 16:1. Chrysostom did not see any sign of a quarrel in Paul's plea to Euodia and Syntyche, as some contend. He saw only praise from Paul. That's why he wrote, quote, "Do you see how great a testimony he, Paul, bears to their virtue?" Once again, that's a homily on Philippians, book 13, John Chrysostom. In the New Testament, or basically in the New Testament text, there are many examples of women who were involved in significant gospel ministry, some as leaders. Even though these women such as Euodia and Syntyche, are mentioned briefly, they do serve as valid biblical precedents for women in ministry today. If Paul valued leadership and ministries of certain women and regarded women as his co workers, we should be careful not to hinder godly, gifted, and capable women from following their calling to be ministers and leaders in the church today. That's basically the end of my presentation. So now we got some other questions for next time. Were Euodia and Syntyche leaders in the Philippian church? What were house churches? Were women apostles? Do women have to be silent in the church? Do women have to call their men Lord? Were women addressed as Lord in the New Testament? So, all of these questions and much more will be addressed soon by Cherry Love and Rakell Salter, the women of the Soldiers of God, the end. Um, so that is the end of my presentation. And like I said, I pretty much just tried to give the bare minimum because trust me, after doing so much research and downloading lots of material, there is a lot to go through. And so all I did was literally just kind of skim through a lot of things. The main thing I wanted to show was that, can women be leaders? Yes. Can women be teachers? Yes. Can women, lead worship services and things? Yes, they can. Can women teach men? Yes. But can women be the head over men? Well, that's the part when, obviously we say no, because, that's roles for the bishop and, for the priests and, pastors even. So even then, those, even when it comes to pastors, I still personally believe that, that role can be either or. And of course, I know a lot of people will argue me with that, but that's why I try to leave that part alone. I just try to put a lot of emphasis on leaders or teachers. So let me see. I have to go back to the screen here. Okay. All right. I hope that was a real blessing to you guys. And other than that, I'm just gonna go ahead and cut this podcast, this live feed. Um, but my Miss Raquel, did you want to say anything before I kind of cut it off?
No, just that was excellent, and I really enjoyed it. And I personally am excited to kind of embark on this. Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Surreal. I appreciate it.
All right, no problem, no problem. Hey, I kind of got scared when I looked at the screen when I came back. I noticed that my PowerPoint wasn't up. I mean, what was it showing the whole time, or did it
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of?
yeah. It was showing. I
Okay,
didn't I didn't miss anything at all.
okay, good, good. Oh, man, like I said, I don't know what kind of bugs I had tonight, but I just had a lot of weird stuff going on. It was saying that my firewall needed to be checked, and and then after that, my PowerPoint would just randomly just stop during the last podcast. So I just I just had to make sure the routine is good. It couldn't hear my mic, and I bought this thing Friday. But yeah, other than that, I guess I'll check the comment section later. It's late and it's cold. Get some rest. And if you're outside, please get inside tonight. It is going to warm up next week. But other than that, um, peace to you guys. Peace and blessings, and God bless.